In 1999, Silent Hill was released on the Sony PlayStation, made by a group of staff members inside of Konami deemed Team Silent. The goal of the game was to compete with Resident Evil, the pioneering survival horror game by Capcom in 1996, and primarily the intent was on making the game with the United States in mind as the audience. Konami, being a Japanese company, wanted to increase their market presence in the West, but that's obviously not their primary motivation in business, so Team Silent was subsequently made up of outcasts inside of Konami. These members were either straight out of school or coming off of a failed project inside of the company. They didn't really fit in and were looking towards leaving the company before Silent Hill came about. Konami is notoriously a profit-oriented company, but the whole project of Silent Hill seemed like a wash and no one knew which direction to take the game. Eventually, upper management lost their faith in the game and left it be. Team Silent therefore went ahead with artistic freedom even though limited by an extreme budget. The result is the birth of psychological horror in video games. The fear of the unknown is what drove this game forward, playing off the player's emotions, using atmosphere, lighting, and sound to create tension instead of traditional horror experiences like jump scares, like their Resident Evil counterpart. The game was strongly focused on story, as Team Silent wanted to make something memorable and not just something that would make some money and then be forgotten. And as it turns out, it ended up being remembered and making a bunch of money. It's considered a masterpiece by many, and it earned Team Silent some temporary respect from Konami, resulting in a sequel being greenlit, letting the team fully express their talents. Team Silent, now with an increase in staff, cash, and a whole lot of ass being the new processing power of the PlayStation 2, they're able to stretch their wings and create what I like to call a dope-ass game. But more importantly, the best horror game ever made, Silent Hill 2. With all the resources on hand, Team Silent was ready to dive into a new game. And rather than doing the traditional sequel thing of going bigger and better, the team decided to hone in on what made the first game so special, the psychological horror. Silent Hill was of course going to be the setting yet again, so with a rough idea of the environment, the narrative was the first thing that Team Silent decided to flesh out, leaving behind the story and the plot of the first game entirely. The goal was to use Silent Hill itself as the vessel for a new narrative. The plot was conceived with heavy inspiration from the Russian novel Crime and Punishment, a book that deals with murder and the justifications for it, as well as the mental anguish that comes from the results of it, such as grief, paranoia, and disgust in oneself. The novel proceeds to slowly dissolve any justifications for the murder and only leaves behind guilt and the horror of the actions. And if you haven't read the book but you have played Silent Hill 2, then you can see just how perfectly that description fits this game all on its own. Team Silent has always been very direct with their inspirations and pop culture references in Silent Hill. From Crime and Punishment influencing the plot of the game to numerous influences on the artistic representation in the game. Filmmakers like David Lynch and his work emphasizing surrealism like on Blue Velvet and Twin Peaks, David Fincher with his works on psychological thrillers like Seven and The Game, and the great David Cronenberg with his works using visceral imagery and body horror like Shivers, Videodrome, and The Fly. Other movies like Jacob's Ladder were heavy inspirations for both Silent Hill 2 and 3, and that movie's honestly the Silent Hill movie we all wanted when they announced this piece of garbage. And if you're a Silent Hill fan and you haven't seen it, please just go watch it. Painters such as Andrew Wyeth and Francis Bacon also played a massive part in the artistic direction the creative directors took when making the environments and the creatures in this game. The very brief overview of Silent Hill 2 is simply a guy named James Sunderland arrives at Silent Hill after receiving a letter from his late wife Mary. That's right, he got a letter from his dead wife. He arrives to find out what's going on because, needless to say, that's pretty fucking weird. He encounters some people along the way like Angela, Eddie, and Maria, all while he searches the town for his wife or to get answers as to why he received this letter. And from this point on, I'm not going to be discussing the plot directly, but I will be mentioning many elements from it, effectively spoiling the entire story. So if you care at all, I would recommend that you don't watch this video. That being said, let's move on.
なんか興味をそそられてしまうっていうか、そのさっきも言いましたけど、その異様な感じですか?
The focus of Team Silent when making Silent Hill 2 is what made all of these elements work. Everything served a purpose, and priority number one was maintaining the thematic elements and atmosphere of the game. This focus is what separates Silent Hill from every other survival horror game, and it's what makes it stand out even inside of its own franchise. Every little thing serves a purpose, even small things that may go unnoticed to most players. Like this corpse that you find inside of Woodside Apartments right after seeing Pyramid Head for the first time. Most people probably think this creepy ass monster just murdered this dude watching TV, but on closer inspection, the person dead in the chair is James himself, conceived straight from James's imagination. The whole world is full of small but significant details, laced with so much care and purpose. This bar is so densely packed with objects, lending to the surrealism of its presence. So many things that you wouldn't think twice about on first glance, but it provides so much atmosphere when you step into it. The bottles all across the shelf, individually textured, the glasses hanging from the ceiling rack, the stockroom full of a wide variety of objects. It's all so minor, but it makes it feel uncanny in a way. Every single area is like that. Most of them you spend less than 5 minutes in and then you move on, but the design is fundamental nonetheless. And these densely detailed places are all supplementary to the claustrophobic feel that this game goes for through the majority of your time there. More clutter and more going on makes things seem busy and closed in, and this is done really well inside of the apartments. The dark and unnerving hallways draw from these highly detailed environments to make you feel more trapped. But other small things in the game, like Mary's letter that slowly fades away as the game goes on, leaving James with a blank piece of paper in his inventory. The letter is what brought him to Silent Hill to begin with, so if it's blank, then what's the reason that he ever came to Silent Hill? Was it his own imagination, or was it the town summoning him? The game is great at providing you with more and more questions as to what's going on rather than giving explanations to you, taking directly from the David Lynch handbook. The themes that all of these things serve draw back to the psychological horror of the game, and in turn the elements of grief, guilt, and punishment. Everything from the enemies to the puzzles and atmosphere all feed these elements. There are reflective metaphors, psychoanalytical nightmares, and twisted locations all throughout the game, constantly challenging the player's perception of what's going on. And this is what makes the game a horror game. In this creepy town full of monsters, it's the human element that drives the horror home. The fear is provided in two parts. The first, by seeing something beyond your understanding, and the second is revealing your true self through whatever concealment that you have tried to employ.
Of course, Ito's references were not merely anecdotal. He also drew inspiration from his favourite artist, the Irish painter Francis Bacon, whose tormented features influenced the visual world of Silent Hill.
The enemies of the game all followed the same thematic loyalty as everything else in the game. The general design was meant to be compared to soured flesh, a tarnished and twisted appearance that just slightly resembles what could be human. There are countless videos and essays going over the metaphors and symbolism behind all the enemies in this game. You can find yourself in a rabbit hole of information if you'd like to, but for the sake of brevity and to stick to the game as a whole in this video, I won't be diving into them here. Simply put, the enemies are a representation of how Mary, James's wife, saw herself during her sickness. She saw herself as tarnished and mutilated. She also wasn't able to be fully intimate with James, and this results in a lot of enemies being overly sexualized, such as the mannequins being quite literally just two pairs of legs stacked on top of one another, the nurses that are wearing low-cut shirts and skirts, and they also represent James's view on the hospital staff during Mary's sickness. And then, of course, there's the giant horn dog himself, Pyramid Head, just walking around, grabbing mannequins as he pleases, swinging around his giant phallic sword. This scene here is actually inspired by one of the scenes from David Lynch's Blue Velvet. James watches from the closet as Pyramid Head has his way with these mannequins. Pyramid Head is also a manifestation of James's guilt and his desire for punishment. Pyramid Head is based on the executioners and the town's cult-riddled past, and therefore were made to put people to death. These monsters aren't meant just to be scary for the sake of being scary. They are driving the narrative like everything else. But also, these are James's personal demons. Every other character in the game doesn't really see these creatures, except the daddy monster and Angela, but this monster represents something entirely different for her than it does for James, but that's a whole nother can of worms. Silent Hill 2 is ultimately a character study. James is one of the most unique protagonists in video games. He isn't some macho space marine or a superhero or anyone with an interesting personality or emotional range. He doesn't even have any cool skills or abilities. He is just simply average white guy number 36. He is the player model given to you before you start customizing your character in an RPG. There is nothing notable about him, and I think that's the whole point. Silent Hill wasn't made for your juicy power fantasies. In fact, its aim is to reverse those roles. Silent Hill makes you powerless, and everything else around you has power over you. It's what makes this game oppressive. If when faced with Pyramid Head you simply whipped out a BFG 9000 as Doom Guy, he wouldn't be such a big deal. What is a big deal is when the first time you fight Pyramid Head, it doesn't even matter how much you shoot him. I mean, it doesn't even matter if you shoot him at all. He will continue to try to swing at you until some alarm sounds, and then he just goes on his way. You aren't anything to him. You're insignificant. You thought this was a boss fight? No, fuck you, says Silent Hill. James also refuses to be relatable to the player, but that's primarily because we never know anything about him. We only know that his wife died and that he received a letter from her saying that she was in Silent Hill. We get small hints throughout the game about him, like he may be an alcoholic, but that's entirely understandable considering that his wife died and it was ultimately at his hands. We never know what he likes, what he dislikes, what he did for a living, which starter Pokemon he would have chosen, nothing. We aren't meant to relate to James. And going back to the letter, we don't even know why he showed up to Silent Hill in the first place. Yeah, he got the letter from Mary saying that she was there, but she's been dead 3 years. Does he think that she's actually still alive? Is he there to save her? Or is he there to finish the job? Or does he think it's a hoax? And if so, what is he gonna do when he finds the culprit? I mean, why are you even here, man? As much as this game is a character study on James, the main character seems to be Silent Hill itself. It's much more than a town, it's an entity. It breathes, it conjures, it has a consciousness. Team Silent knew that it was the driving factor in what made the first game so special, which is why it's the only thing that remains in the sequel. We don't need any more of Harry or Cheryl or the cultists, we just need Silent Hill. It's fairly obvious at several points that the town is alive, when things happen that there is no explanation for. Like James finding a letter that directs him to the Silent Hill Historical Center. Who wrote the letter? There is no one else ever seen in the town other than the characters you've already met, and they are accounted for, and they also have their own shit going on and could care less about James and his search for Mary. There's also the obnoxious game show that happens in the elevator at the hospital. A chipper talk show host calls James by name and quizzes him on things that can only be answered if you've explored the town. There obviously isn't some Regis Philbin type dude hanging around anywhere. The town is alive, and it's asking,
who wants to be a millionaire? Here we go.
The town itself allows for new stories inside of it, encompassing new struggles with deep and taboo subjects not often seen in gaming. This is enhanced when you bring in some of the other characters that you find in the town. Eddie is an emotionally unstable guy who is suffering from the guilt over killing a dog, shooting a football player in the knee, and the trauma of constantly being bullied and laughed at. Several times when you encounter him, there are corpses about. The first time in the Woodside Apartments, there's a dead body inside of a fridge in the same apartment where Eddie is puking in the bathroom. He passionately denies any involvement with the body, but as the game goes on, the town does its thing. Eddie devolves into the acceptance of himself. There is a body next to him in the cafeteria of the prison, except instead of denying his involvement, he tries to justify killing the man because he was making fun of him, going on to say killing someone is really no big deal. Eddie's version of the town is people constantly laughing at him and bullying him. He is haunted by it, and he eventually sees James as doing the same thing, and he tries to kill him.
I'll kill you, James!
There's also Angela, another tragic tale of trauma at a young age. Instead of bullying though, Angela was sexually abused by her father and was forced to kill him in self-defense. She is haunted by the murder and is stricken with grief and guilt over her actions. She has extreme suicidal depression, seeing the world as not worth living for, and is entirely hopeless, and the town reflects this. Her town of Silent Hill is always on fire, and when faced with monsters, it's the likes of Abstract Daddy, a monster resembling two figures atop a bed frame. It's kind of shocking seeing things like this in a mainstream video game from 2001. It's got to be one of the most accurate and surreal representations of sexual abuse and trauma on a young child or teenager, facing the difficulty of coming to terms with what can easily be irreversible damage. The music and sound design is a masterpiece all on its own in this game. It is perhaps the best scored soundtrack when it comes to horror, and like everything else in the game, it all ties back to Thematic Solidarity. The music of the game was made without putting the melody at the forefront, but instead the sounds used in the music took priority. That isn't to say that there aren't many melodic bangers in this game, but the sounds used were meant to boost the emotions of the scene at hand onto the player. Like after getting to Maria behind the bars, but it's too late. The music even plays after you leave the area, making you dwell on the cutscene even after you venture off. Or at the hotel after James accepts and comes to terms with killing his wife. The noise is like a droning headache, disorienting you in a rapidly deteriorating environment. It all feeds off of each other, and needless to say, this pairs exceptionally well with the sound design of the game. From the start of the game, when you're venturing down the path from the rest stop, you are slowly introduced to noises. Growls from the incoming fog, creatures of unknown variety shuffling about in the forest, and this carries on throughout the game. Random cries from a baby when you're inside of the apartment. What sounds like a horse and carriage stampeding towards you at the gallows in the prison, and many more. And what is almost more powerful is the silence used in the game. The juxtaposition of loud and intense music suddenly cutting to silence is really jarring, and most of the time it just adds to the tension rather than relieves it. Take for example entering Neely's bar off the noisy streets of Silent Hill. Loud, atmospheric music paired with the constant radio static of nearby enemies, and then silence. Same for the apartments. At one moment it's loud and torturous, and the next it's nothing but James's footsteps. It's quite beautiful. That's how this game typically scares you though. It's not your typical horror game stuff like jump scares. Yeah, there are a few, some that are enemies suddenly appearing after moments of calm, like after you get your flashlight. But sometimes the enemies just appear and attempt to scare, like this guy trying to be all stealthy, or these things just being catapulted at you from the fog of war. But sometimes it's not even enemies and just the game fucking with you, like in the prison. You're in the bathroom, you're on the edge, of course. There's this closed stall at the end. You're already expecting something to be in there. So you knock on the door. Nothing. You try again. Alright, cool. Nothing is there. Let's just leave. Sometimes it's not even that. The game will build tension and then subvert your expectations of a scare. Like when you have to stick your hand in some random drippy hole in the wall. But Silent Hill never cheapens its experience with scripted jump scares. It's all very minor and just adds to the tension overall. And these minor moments only spook you so much because the tension is already at 100% at all times. Even things happen incidentally that scare you, like entering an area. You go left. Nope, it's the wrong way. So you turn around, bam, mannequin, just chilling. I nearly pooped right there. It's not even a jump scare. But if I would have turned right when I went down those stairs, then I would have just killed it and moved on. But now it's just there.
He's just standing there, menacingly.
Even being introduced to the main antagonist in the game, Pyramid Head, you first find him just chilling in the apartments. Just there. You stumble across him, just standing there.
Menacingly.
Before you finally find the courage to walk away, and from that point on, you know that he's there, just wandering the halls and watching you. You don't know when he'll turn up and try to touch you with his phallic sword. It turns out he never does, but that doesn't stop you from thinking that he will. The atmosphere is no doubt the glue that binds this game together. Everything that I've talked about so far builds and supplements the atmosphere. The environments, the monsters, the characters, the music, the sound, the tension, the scares, and the lack thereof all makes a thick atmosphere that it might as well be visible. And that's probably why there's fog in the first place. This game also uses a variety of spatial sizes to give a feeling of unease throughout the game. You start off in an open and distant area. Visualizing your adventure into Silent Hill is far from civilization. You are going into a place that is disconnected from the world in more ways than one. And once inside the city, you feel closed in with narrow hallways and densely detailed environments before expanding once again into irrationally long areas to disorient you. Long walks down roads that never seem to end, staircases to hell, several holes that James is just willing to jump into, a giant lake to row in with no direction, and never-ending hallways that must have cost a fortune to lay carpet in, and an overly long staircase to the final confrontation in the game. It's like the closer James gets to confronting himself and what he did, the more he wants it to not happen. Like he's blaming the environment for his procrastination. And I can really go on for hours about how everything in this game reflects back to creating a masterpiece in atmosphere. I can dissect Eddie's large supreme pizza for at least 20 minutes all on its own. But I think it's time to wrap this thing up. Silent Hill 2 is like nothing else. Even within its own franchise, the game stands out. It's a milestone in strong characters, narratives, and well-crafted environments. You'd be hard-pressed to find a game that provides such thematic loyalty with every single element in the game. No game can really compete here. Every scene, every camera angle, every character design, monster, puzzle, every last molecule of fog means something in this game. Realistically, Silent Hill 2 isn't excellent in all realms of gaming. The combat is dull, some of the puzzles are a little janky and don't really make all that much sense. Like, honestly, who would throw a case of juice down the garbage chute in order to find something? But in the grand scheme of things, it all works out. Team Silent made bangers. Silent Hill 1 through 4 are all top tier horror titles, but I'm not alone when I say that Silent Hill 2 is the fucking peak. The worst thing about this game is the fact that it's so hard to get your hands on it. Konami fucking sucks, and the game isn't available remastered or anything on new consoles, so original discs on original hardware is the way to go. And as we all know, that shit can get expensive and will not last forever. This game has a serious chance of going extinct without emulation, which is how I played this game for the video. This is the PC version of the game using the enhanced edition fan mod, and honestly it looks and runs like any game that came out this year. If only Konami took care of their franchises or their fans to produce remastered content, or even allow some kind of sequel by a passionate developer. Kojima. Silent Hills. But alas, we only get to see our boy Pyramid Head in Dead by Daylight and fucking patchy slots. I love Silent Hill 2, but fuck Konami.